A sane observer sees the nest of an abhorrent ghoul king as a pit of horror and cannibalism infested with nightmares. But the king and his court do not. They see themselves as a grand and proud people, a nation defined by virtue, honour and duty. In this video, we're going to be showing you how to paint an abhorrent ghoul king with a crown of delusion. And the first thing we need to do is undercoat the model, and to do this, we've chosen to use grey cere. So, with that said, grab your brushes, shake those paints, and let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is paint the throne. For this, we're going to base coat with Mechanica Standard Grey, then shade with Nuln Oil. So let's get some Mechanica Standard Grey onto the palette. To add some water just to thin it down a bit. There we go. Then roll your brush up to a point. And we're just going to paint that entire throne in grey. You'll probably want to do a few layers of this. Don't worry about being too neat at this stage, as we'll be painting the other areas anyway. And next we're going to apply Nuln Oil all over the throne. When you're doing this, work in small sections so that the paint doesn't dry too quickly anywhere and you get a nice consistent finish across the miniature. And with that dry, we're now going to highlight that area. So for this, we're actually just going to dry brush Dawnstone onto the model. So I've got a small dry brush here. I'm going to take some paint out onto a paper towel. What we want to do here is work off as much of that paint as possible. So we just leave a small amount of almost dry paint on the bristles. There we go. Then what we're going to do is lightly brush that across all the raised detail on the miniature. This will catch all those edges and create a highlight. And with that dry brush done, we can now move on to some other areas. So we're going to focus next on the leathers and the cloth. And for these, we're going to use wildwood, followed by a shabty bone. Then dryad bark, agrax earthshade, and Gawthor brown. So we're going to get a little bit of wildwood onto the palette, just to control how much is on our brush, because we don't want too much. There we go. And we're just going to be applying that onto the handle of the sword and any ropes too. There we are, we've picked out the handle and also the ropes around the throne too. Now we're going to use a shabty bone as a highlight for those areas. So we're just picking out that raised detail there. And the next thing we're going to do is use dryad bark to pick out any areas of cloth, including the cloak. Again, you'll probably want to do a couple of layers of this. And once all of those areas are picked out, we're now going to apply agrax earthshade over the top. If you find it pooling too much in any of the recesses, just clean off your brush and use it to soak up the excess. Once that's fully dry, we're going to apply an edge highlight of Gawthor brown. When you're doing this, use the edge of your brush where you can, as this will do most of the work for you. Be as neat as you can, but if you do make any mistakes, you can just tidy back up with some dryad bark. And with that done, we're now going to move on to the gold areas. So for these, we're going to use Runelord Brass, followed by Agrax Earthshade, Runefang Steel, and then Nylock Oxide as well. So let's get some Runelord Brass here. Onto the palette, thin it down with some water. Here we go, make sure you've got a nice point on your brush. And we're just going to pick out those gold areas. So this is this area of the sword here, and also the crown. And next we're just going to apply Agrax Earthshade over the top of all those areas. Next we're going to pick out the edges with Runefang Steel. You don't need to highlight every single edge, just pick out the more prominent ones. Now we're going to add some weathering effects with nylic oxide. And we're just going to drop this into the recesses. If you've got too much on your brush, just clean off your brush and use it to soak up any excess. We want this to be quite subtle. And with the gold done, we're now going to move on to the silver details. So for these, we're going to use Iron Warriors, Norn Oil, Runefang Steel and Scrag Brown. So let's get some Iron Warriors here onto the palette. As usual, add a touch of water just to thin it down. There we go. And we're just going to pick out all those silver details. So we've picked out the sword and also the little rivets on the back of the throne there in the silver. And now we're going to apply Norn Oil over those areas. And now we're going to edge highlight those areas with Runefang Steel. And the next thing we're going to do is add a rust effect to those silver details. So for this, we're just going to thin down some Scrag Brown with water. So let's take some Scrag Brown onto the palette. Then we're going to add some water to it. A little bit more. We're looking to make it the same as almost a wash consistency. There we go. Just make sure there's not too much on your brush. There we go. Then we're just going to drop that into any recess detail. And this will just create that rust effect. And with that weathering done, we're now going to move on to the bone areas. So for these, we're going to use Skeleton Horde followed by a Shabty Bone. So let's get some Skeleton Horde onto the palette, just to control how much is on the brush. There we are. Make sure there's not too much on the brush. And we're just going to apply that straight onto any bone areas. As we're applying the contrast paint straight over the undercoat, just make sure to tidy up with some grey cere beforehand if it needs it. And the next thing we're going to do is edge highlight with a Shabty Bone. And now that the bone is all highlighted, we're going to move on to the black areas. So for these, we're going to use Corvus Black followed by Dawnstone. Let's get some onto the palette now. Add some water just to make it smoother. There we go. We're going to use this to pick out all the black areas. This is things like the claws and the teeth as well as the fur. Next, we're going to use Dawnstone as an edge highlight on those black areas. Again, we don't need to pick out every single edge, just the most prominent ones. And with that highlight done, we're now going to move on to the skin. So for this, we're going to use Militarum Green, thin down with Contrast Medium, then highlight up with Deepkin Flesh. So let's get some medium onto the palette. We're going to take 3 parts, that's 1, 2 and 3. Then clean off the brush and make sure to dry it as well. Then 1 part Militarum Green, and then we're going to mix that in together there. There we go. Then just make sure there's not too much on your brush. And we're going to just apply that all over the skin. You might find it looks quite subtle at first, but don't worry, we'll be going back into those recesses with some more Militarum Green in a minute. And the next thing we're going to do is highlight with Deepkin Flesh. Now just make sure that you've thinned down the paint quite a lot, as we want it to be quite subtle on the miniature. We'll be highlighting most of the raised edges with this. And with the skin finished, we're now going to move on to the eyes. So for these, we're going to base coat them with grey cere and then apply Frost Heart over the top. So we're going to just take a little bit of grey cere out onto the palette and thin it down with some water. Then make sure you've got a good point on your brush, as this is quite detailed. There we go. And then just carefully pick out those eyes. Next, we're just going to apply some frost art over that base coat. When you're doing this, you don't want too much on your brush, and if you do find it pooling too much, just clean off your brush and use it to soak up the excess. And now the eyes are done, we can move on to the base. So for this, we're going to use astrogranite debris, then apply Agrax Earthshade over it and dry brush with Dawnstone. So we've got the large end of the texture tool here, and we're going to scoop some out. There we go, and then we're just going to carefully apply that onto the base. And then switch to the smaller side to push it around the detail on the base. Technical paint will take around an hour to dry. And once that's fully dry, we're going to apply Agrax Earthshade all over the base. And the last thing we're going to do is just dry brush Dawnstone onto the base. This will just catch the raised areas of the texture paint and create a highlight. And now with the base finished, the last thing to do is paint the rim of the base in a colour of your choosing. In this case, we've chosen Steel Legion Drab. And now our abhorrent Ghoul King is ready to lead his court and eat all those who oppose them. So there's just a couple of things to remember when you're painting this miniature. When you're highlighting, keep your paints nice and thin, as this will give you a smooth layer and an even consistency. Also, when you're base coating, be as neat as you can, as this will provide a better end result, but don't worry too much. If you do make any mistakes, you can just tidy back up with the other colours. Well, that's the end of the video. We hope you've enjoyed watching, and we hope you have great fun painting your own miniatures. We'll see you next time. Bye!